I've never had the best of luck with guys. I appear to have poor taste when it comes to dating. After separating for good from my kid's father after 5 years, I was ready to just be myself. About 3 months of being a single mother, my neighbor approached me stating that a friend of his, Steve, would like to meet me. It didn't take long before he charmed his way into my life. The first 6 months were amazing, but he began to drink more and more, and each time he would get extremely agitated. He would start fights with random people, and even some of our friends. Slowly, our friends would stop coming around, knowing how Steve got when he drank. This, however, did not stop him from drinking. But now all the anger was aimed at me. It took roughly 6 to 8 months of buildup, from name-calling and shoving to punching and choking. Suddenly, this became a very abusive relationship. One time, I escaped out of the bathroom window. He later found me by beating up a friend of mine until he told him where I was. Steve began stripping all of my clothes off in a drunken rage while laughing at me and challenging me to go ahead and try to escape while I was naked. The last night of abuse was by far the worst. Before Steve started drinking that night, I told him that my son, 3 years old, was not feeling very well, and I was going to stay with him as he fell asleep. My plan was to spend the night with my son. At around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the bedroom door open. I lied there pretending to be asleep. Several seconds went by. I held my breath as tears began to form in my eyes. When I suddenly felt his hand on top of my head, he grabbed my hair and yanked me out of bed, whispering in my ear, "I know you're avoiding me." Once in the living room, he threw me on the floor, then accused me of trying to leave him and demanded to know why. Before I could answer, he angrily came to the conclusion that it was another man. "I swear to God, if I catch you with another man, I'll kill you and him." He was obviously more drunk than normal. He punched and kicked me a couple of times, and I fell to the floor. I started to crawl to my son's room, and he slowly came from behind me, asking, "Where do you think you're going?" He then walked in front of me, kneeled down, and said, "You stay right there or I'm gonna hurt you real bad." He then sat on the couch and watched me as I sobbed on the floor. After about 30 minutes, it appeared that he passed out on the couch. I decided that this was my chance to escape. I put on an oversized shirt, picked up my son, and slowly crept by him. He suddenly woke up and grabbed my leg and said, "Where are you going?" I stammered out that I was going into the kitchen with my son to get him a drink. He then angrily replied, "Hurry up." As soon as I entered the kitchen, I ran out of the front door with no pants on, no shoes, and no purse. I carried my son all the way to the police station, which was thankfully only a few blocks away. After hours, the way the police station is set up is that you go into a room and press a button and talk to someone on the intercom. I ran in and put my back to the wall and pushed the button behind me as I slowly slid down into a sitting position while holding on to my son, waiting for Steve to burst through the door at any second. I remembered thinking if I was going to be beaten, at least it would be on camera. On the speaker, I heard, "How can I help you?" All I could do was cry. I couldn't even get a word out of my mouth. I didn't know how to explain. 2 officers came out to assist me. A female officer took my son and got him some food, and I went with the male officer to make a report, and he gave me a blanket. After 15 minutes, I heard Steve screaming my name as they brought him down the hallway. I held my breath as if he knew I was behind the door. 30 minutes later, an officer came back with a sergeant. At first, I thought they were going to tell me to go back home and gather my belongings while Steve was being held in custody. Instead, they asked me more questions about his anger issues and if there had been any previous fights. I explained to them Steve's alcohol problem and how he had become increasingly more abusive. They then showed me a list in Steve's handwriting detailing how he would dismember my body in a good spot where I would be buried without being found. He also had possible dates written down with past dates crossed out. I couldn't breathe when I read this, and by this point tears were streaming down my face. I looked at the cop and asked, "What does this mean?" He looked back at me and said, "It means you're lucky." Steve was charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and assault. I left back home to Arizona before the trial started, but gave a detailed statement before I left. Steve, of course, pled not guilty, but in the end, he received 2 years in prison. Just before I left for Arizona, I received a letter from Steve. It simply read, "It's not over. You'll always be mine." I'm a female, and I'm 27. At the time of this story, I was only 19. I was living in Littleton, which is a suburb of Denver. I lived and worked in the same block, working at a hair salon, and lived in an apartment that was across the street. I lived with 4 other people in a studio apartment. Yes, it was chaos. But I was young and dumb, and I worked so much that I was only ever there to sleep. While working at the salon, I met people from all walks of life. Most were nice and hardworking like myself. In the plaza where the salon was located, there happened to be an abundance of loiterers, homeless drunks mostly. There was a particular man who I would often see. He always smelled like booze, but was nice enough. He was quite the flirt, which was a bit uncomfortable for 19-year-old me. On several occasions, he asked me to come hang out and drink with him. I always declined, telling him that I had a boyfriend. For the life of me, I cannot remember this man's name, so for the sake of the story, I will call him Mark. One afternoon, after getting off work around 4, I began to make my way across the parking lot to the coffee shop. I ordered my drink and took it outside to sit and enjoy the sunny weather. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mark approaching me rapidly. A broad smile was on his face. He came up to me and asked me for a lighter. Begrudgingly, I obliged, passing it over. Mark lit up a cigarette and returned the lighter to me, as he not so gracefully brushes my arm. A disgusting chill ran up my spine. I pulled away and suddenly stood up, saying that it was time for me to go. Mark then begged me to come drink with him, and again, I refused. After that, I didn't see him for several weeks. It was a bliss, since he was always lurking around the plaza, waiting for some sorry soul to look his way. One night, I decided to go for a night stroll. I enjoy night walks around this time of year because of the weather. I would walk around downtown Littleton and loop back to my apartment complex. I was maybe 10 minutes away from my home when a figure appeared in the walkway ahead of me. I thought it was nothing at first, since a lot of people were out and about. But when I got a closer look, I could recognize that it was Mark. He was swaying this way and that on the sidewalk, nearly falling into the road. This is where I made my first mistake. I should have crossed the road or turned around. Instead, I decided to walk past him, hoping that he wouldn't recognize me in his intoxicated state. But unfortunately, he did. Mark got in my way and stopped, smiling that broad smile once again. I sighed, resigning to my fate of having to walk with him. I asked him how he had been, and if he was having a good day. He said he was, but it would be a whole lot better if he had someone to drink with. I said that I couldn't, because I had to work early the next morning. Unfortunately, he was unbothered and continued to beg, trying the drunk puppy dog eyes on me. I was slightly uneasy, but otherwise unmoved. Awkwardly laughing, I tried to edge my way around him, but he held out his arms, blocking my path. With a serious face, I demanded Mark move out of my way so I could return home. For some reason, this flipped a switch within him. Suddenly, he grabbed my arm, holding it tightly. I winced and I tried to shake him off, but Mark wouldn't let go. He took another step towards me and grabbed my other arm. Immediately, I knew it was going to bruise. The pain sent me into fight or flight, and I picked both. First, I shoved Mark as hard as I could into a bush that was behind him, and then I started sprinting down the sidewalk. I didn't stop until I burst through my apartment door. I dissolved into tears and fell on the floor. Alarmed, my roommates comforted me and started asking me questions about what happened. After I pulled my shit together, I told them what Mark did. By this time, my boyfriend was in the apartment and was furious upon hearing this. He stormed out of the apartment with a bat in his hand. Another roommate stayed with me. When my boyfriend returned, he said that he couldn't find him. We thought about calling the cops, but rejected the idea because we weren't exactly on the right side of the law ourselves. Marijuana wasn't legal yet in Colorado. So instead, I decided to buy some pepper spray and start carrying a knife on my person. It made me feel much safer. And I stopped going for walks after dark, unless my boyfriend went with me. Strangely, I never saw Mark again after that night, though I was completely okay with it. So wherever you may have gone, Mark, just leave me alone. Next time, I'll poke a hole in you. This happened to me about 4 years ago. I'm 23 now, so I was 19 at the time that this took place. I was up late one night playing video games as I usually did on the weekends. I remember very clearly that it was storming that night. It was a pretty bad one too. The wind outside had to be up to around 50 miles per hour, and the rain was coming down hard. I was worried about my power possibly going out, as it was a common occurrence whenever it stormed. After a few hours of playing my game, I began to get hungry, so I made my way into the kitchen to make a snack. I live in a mobile home community, so each home sits pretty close to each other. As I was making a sandwich, I heard a few popping sounds from outside. At first, I just assumed that it was thunder, but then I heard a couple of more pops. I looked out the window that was next to the back door, which was facing the direction I had heard the noises from. I really couldn't see much, other than the dim light emanating from a nearby lamppost that overlooked the street behind my house. Thinking that it was just the storm, I finished up in the kitchen and shut off all the lights and went back to my gaming. After about 10 minutes, I could have sworn that I heard a noise coming from my front door. I had a motion light that would go off at even the slightest movement anywhere near my front porch. So I looked out of my bedroom window, and I could see the glare of light coming from my front porch. Having heard the noise and seeing the light now, I knew that someone or something had triggered it. I was home alone, and I was getting a bit creeped out. I made my way through the dark house into the front door. The door had a diamond-shaped window at the center of it, and I crouched down to keep myself from view. I slowly lifted my head and peeked out, but nothing was there. I opened the door and stepped out into the rainy night, and still I saw nothing. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. As I was making my way back to my room, I could see the flashing of red and blue lights from a cop car coming through the window on my back door. I went over to the door and saw at least 3 cop cars sitting on the road. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I could see 2 officers talking to someone who lived in one of the mobile homes on that street. I watched for a while until I got bored and went back into my room. It wasn't until the next day that I saw on the news something that scared me to my very core. The noises that I heard the night before turned out to be gunshots. According to the police, it was a drug deal that had gone wrong. 2 men had been gunned down, killed execution style. One man was shot in the head, and the other was shot a few times in the chest while sitting down in a chair. The police had reason to believe that this was gang-related. One of the men were identified after a family member reported him missing. The other victim was the owner of the mobile home, who had set up a meeting with the drug dealers. Needless to say, things went south fast. I came forward to the police after having seen the news reports. I am completely convinced that what I heard on my porch that night was the man who had just killed those two men trying to get into my home, as the police were called very soon after the shots were heard. I told the police this, and they also agreed that the killer was seeking a place to hide, and just happened to choose my home as there was no car outside and he may have thought nobody was there. But once he heard me walking down the hall, he must have ran off into the night. I'm not sure what happened after this, or if the man was ever caught, because I never heard back from the police after giving my statement. It scares me to think what could have happened if that man chose to break open my door, or if I hadn't heard the noises coming from my porch. I very well could have been the next victim. I consider myself very lucky that I never encountered the killer that night. Always be safe. You never know who's out there in the dark.
There's always a reason to be afraid.